So tonight's program is in celebration of the Waterfront. And we at the Brooklyn Historical Society are celebrating Waterfront big time with gusto. Because as I hope many of you know, a number of months ago, we opened a second location in Dumbo, in the Empire Stores in Brooklyn Bridge Park. And just less than a week ago, we opened a major long-term exhibition titled Waterfront. And so this exhibition is really, it's a multimedia experience. It's multi-layered, it's interactive, it brings to life many of the themes and stories and history of Brooklyn's coastline, from labor to oysters to landfill, to 19th century warehouses, to enslaved Brooklynites, to post-industrial abandonment, to global sea rise, all of that in a very wonderful, dense, creative exhibition. And as we thought about how to celebrate that in programming, really we could think of no more perfect a partnership to kick off what I hope will be, and know will be, many, many programs inspired by that exhibition, than to partner with Underwater New York. Nicole, Nikki, Nicole, Helen, thank you so much for being such wonderful partners. So now I have the pleasure and honor of introducing one of the Underwater New York Nicoles, who will be moderating tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to her for the rest of the evening. She, in turn, will introduce our panelists and artists. Nicole Harutunian is one of the editors of Underwater New York, along with Nikki Pombier-Berger, Nicole Miller, and Helen Georgas. She's the author of the short story collection Speed Dreaming and works as a museum educator. Along with her Underwater New York co-editors, she is literary editor of the anthology Silent Beaches, Untold Stories, New York City's Forgotten Waterfront by Elizabeth Albert, which you may have seen is available at our shop, as are many other things, works from the folks who are going to be speaking tonight: Chester Higgins' Echo of the Spirit, Photographer's Journey, two beautiful broadsides created by Underwater New York that feature poems that you will hear tonight set alongside artwork that you will see tonight, and a puzzle by one of our artists, Barry Rosenthal. So all of that, after you hear them, you can see some of their books and work in our shop. So on that note, please help me welcome Nicole.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Marcia and Stephen and the Brooklyn Historical Society. Thanks also to Poets and Writers, Irving Bottle, and all of you for being here. So I'm Nicole Harutunian, one of the 4 editors of Underwater New York. Is anybody here familiar with Underwater New York already? Okay, a couple people. So what we are is a digital arts platform that publishes work across all genres, inspired by the waterfront of New York City, the waterways, things that are submerged within the waterways of New York City that are reported to us by all kinds of people. There is a giraffe skeleton in the lower bay of New York that people have created work about. There is a Formica dinette standing upright on the floor of the East River near East 16th Street. There's a fleet of ice cream trucks sunk off the Rockaways. So there are many, many sort of wild underwater New York objects that we curate on our site that are ripe for invention. So go ahead and visit Underwater New York and check that out. What we also do is in real life events like this, so we're not just digital. And we're really pleased to be able to work with these writers and these artists tonight. And we're really happy to be here in conjunction with the exhibition Waterfront at the Dumbo Gallery of the Brooklyn Historical Society. So So when that gallery opened, our founding editor, Nikki Pomyer-Berger, she was there before any of the rest of us, and she spotted Chester Higgins' photographs, and she started texting us on our group text. And as soon as I saw his images of Mafa, which is a ceremony that he'll tell you all about, it commemorates the brutality of the Middle Passage. In my head, I started hearing Cynthia Manic's poetry. I had just heard her read her poem, Middle Passage. And I wrote back, what if we pair up these two artists and we create a broadside? So they both agreed to it, and a designer, Dan Selzer, put it together for us. And that started our broadside project this summer. So that is part of the inspiration for our night tonight. Both of them are here. So what we're going to do is kind of bookend our panel with readings by poets that come from the broadsides that we've created at Underwater New York. And we're going to start off with Cynthia's reading. So Cynthia Manic is going to read from her poem Requiem for Sea and Chains. And before she does that, let me just tell you a little bit about who she is. So Cynthia Manic is the author of Blue Hallelujahs, a Pushcart Prize-nominated poet with an MFA in creative writing from the New School. She has received fellowships from Cave Canem, the Callaloo Creative Writing Workshop, Fine Arts Work Center, Malay Colony, Hedgebrook, Poets House, and the Vermont Studio Center. A winner of the 2016 Lascaux Prize in Collected Poetry and a 2017 recipient of the Barbara Memorial Fund for Poetry, Manick serves as East Coast editor of the independent press, Jammy Publishing, and is founder and curator of the reading series Soul Sister Review. Her poem, Things I Carry Into the World, was recently made into a film by Motion Poems, an organization dedicated to video poetry. Manick's work has appeared in the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day series, African American Review, Bone Bouquet, Callaloo, Clockhouse, Human Equity Through Art, Quelly Journal, Muzzle Magazine, Obsidian, Literature in the African Diaspora, Pluck, St. Anne's Review, the Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. She currently resides here in Brooklyn. Please welcome Cynthia Manic. As she reads, actually, I'm going to project the broadside so you get the visual with her words. Okay, here's Cynthia.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Brooklyn Historical Society. I'm honored to be here. Requiem for Sea and Chains for the Middle Passage. Who knew a body of water could be this large? A mountain to the smallest selves who made it to the hulls alive, their voices slipping like a saffron bolt. At half-mast, Chains learned not to scream, count heartbeats and swallow mouthfuls of dust. The deck split open as some leaped with the moon, tossed their kinky manes to the sea. Others fell to the dark, spine and spirit broke, were tossed to the reefs like open umbrellas while the sun looked on. Praise the mist and bone thief, holding our seas on ocean floors. Who knew water could swallow bodies so quietly? Thanks.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. So I think how we'll do this is we're gonna have each of the 4 artists who are up here right now present on a project that has something to do with the waterfront. And I'll introduce them kind of as we go. And after that, we're gonna invite, we have one more poet, we'll invite them up to read, and then our 2 poets will join us and we'll have a little bit of a conversation, and then we'll open it up for a question and answer. So I've got the clicker and we'll be showing their work projected above us as we go. So I want to introduce first Chester Higgins. who was the other half of that broadside with Cynthia. So Chester Higgins was born in Lexington, Kentucky, and grew up in New Brockton, Alabama. He attended Tuskegee Institute, where he was mentored by the school's official photographer, P.H. Polk, and graduated in 1970 with a bachelor's degree in business management. Higgins worked as a New York Times photographer since 1975 and exhibited in museums throughout the world. Higgins' work is included in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art and has been included in numerous book collections and appeared in publications such as Newsweek, Fortune, Look, Essence, and Life. He is represented by the Peter Fetterman Gallery of Santa Monica, California. So, Chester, there's so much that you could probably tell us about tonight, but let's hear about your photograph specifically of Mafa. And also, since we're thinking about the water, I know that you have some work that touches on water in the African diaspora. So we would love to hear you talk about that.
Okay. The Maafa images came about as I was just living, because in the beginning, I've always been concerned with the memory of water as it relates to people of African descent. And looking back, traveling and living in Africa in the early 70s, I was taken with going from different ports where Africans had been captured. They call them slave forts. And they have these doors that lead out at the time to docks where boats were docked. And these doors are called the door of no return. So water, in the history of my people coming together with a foreign culture, water became the bridge that brought us here. But but water never lost its spiritual, natural meaning. And so I try to show that in my, okay. This is a picture where, so the issue is, how do we come to peace with the memory of water, and how do we use water, and how do we use water as a healing force? And here you see these priestesses down in Brazil who have this ritual where they go once a year and they make this offering to the water, the fresh water, the water of Oshun. And then, what was the picture? Is there a picture before, after that? And this is a picture in Niger, in Mopti, on the Niger River, showing, I was trying to find some sort of way to symbolize this transit across the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Americas. And one day this image presented itself to me. And next one. This actually, I guess, should have been the beginning. I didn't sequence these. Because this is one of the doors of no return from the slave castle on Gorée Island, Senegal, in the harbor of Dakar. And I spent a summer living in this island and making friends, and were able to just go back. In the beginning, it was quite difficult for me to go to this place, but gradually I became able to walk in, to spend some time, spend longer time, and look at the dungeons. But what was really drawing me was the water outside the door of no return, where in those days, 350 years ago, these ships would pull up and the Africans would be sold. And the reason it's called the door of no return, because once the foot of the people were touched that doorway going to the ships, they could never return. They would go and they would live and die in the Americas. And in fact, in my early history, my own family, I'm fortunate enough to know that my great-great-grandfather came from the Gambia area. And as an old man, there's stories of him fishing and saying he wished he could swim back home, because his capture came maybe about 10, 15 years before the Civil War. So in a way, I don't know if there's something in me. Since '71, I've always spent each year apart as much time as I can in Africa, and maybe it's because of him. I had no idea until then. But so he could not swim back, but I could fly back. And in flying back, I could try to look at these pieces and how water figures within not only his life, but all of our lives. And then the Maafa image is, this comes from there was this minister who was head of St. Paul Baptist Church in East New York named Johnny Youngblood. And Johnny Youngblood felt that he wanted to do something with his congregation to help them get past the victimology, which is a very paralyzing effect that a lot of our people suffer from. To get them to realize, if you're a victim, nobody can help you. You need a doctor, but if you learn to de-victimize yourself, then you can help yourself take responsibility for what is. Yes, things are not perfect, but you have to take that and go on. And he would do this week-long seminar where he would have actors and people come in and really dramatize the horror of our history in this place. And then the last evening of this ceremony was, okay, how do you free yourself from that and then try now to feel that you're worthy of rebirth? And there was always this early morning service or activity where the last thing after these services on the beach was to ritually go back and touch the water, the same water that has the memory of our ancestors, the same water that we think is the largest cemetery in the ocean, is the cemetery of African people who either died or jumped aboard vessels from vessels coming on that 6-week passage. That our healing is a part of going forward from here, but also finding a ritualistic way to use water as a purifying force to purify us from this victimology, at the same time being able to reach back to the part of us that we've been disconnected to. So that's what the sequence of how Ma'afa came to be.
Thank you so much, Chester. And how do you see the role of your photographs in what you're talking about?
Well, I like to think that the role of my photographs fundamentally is education and healing. Education to us all about each other, and also everybody's we're all in need of healing. We all have traumatic experiences in our lives, in our gene pools, but we still have to go on. And how do we find a way that we are emotionally fortified, that gives our life meaning, and have the faith to give our life hope.
Thank you so much. We'll come back to some of that, I think. Let me pass out this water that I seem to be hogging, and then I'm gonna. Exactly. Speaking of water. So next, I want to introduce you to Barry Rosenthal. Barry Rosenthal is a fine art photographer and also an urban archaeologist and sculptor. He studied photography at the Dayton Art Institute in Dayton, Ohio, and at the Epiron workshops in Millerton, New York, with notable photographers Emmett Gowan and George Tice. Barry's fine art images can be found in the permanent collection of the Museum of Fine Art in New York City and the Springfield Museum of Fine Art in Springfield, Massachusetts. Barry is a resident of Lower Manhattan along with his wife and daughter. His project, Found in Nature, has a worldwide following and has created opportunities for Barry to talk about his work to a larger audience. His photographs have been published in arts and culture magazines as well as general interest news publications around the world. In the fall of 2010, Rosenthal became a resident artist at Chashama in the Brooklyn Army Terminal in Brooklyn, New York. It was then that he was able to refine his vision of his project to where it became socially and environmentally conscious. So Barry, just like Chester's body of work, we're really interested in so many aspects of yours at Underwater New York. And one of the sort of key points that we zeroed in on is a quote that we emailed about a little bit when you talked about the waterfront as being like your flea market. So if you want to tell us about your project, Found in Nature, and then unpack that for us a little bit.
Okay. So, yes, I did say that about... I like to go flea marketing at one point in my life, and it was a very familiar kind of experience. When I discovered the area that I go picking in here in Brooklyn at Floyd Bennett Field, I started to realize that, everything was free, everything was available to me. There were really no limitations, and everything I found I could use. So it was like that flea market experience. And then, it's not like going shopping at Walmart or something where I'm not going to buy new things. I'm at the mercy of what I find, and then I'm also at the mercy of what I can put together. So that's what found objects are all about, I guess.
Great.
What do you? Oh, okay. So this first one is about alcohol, and I realized a few years into the project that I could make a comment about society that was a little beyond the trash that I'd been working with. The general theme was marine pollution, and what we're filling in the oceans, and I'm sure you've heard about all the numbers that are out there, but they say by 2050 we'll have the same amount of seafood as trash in the oceans. So it's kind of a tipping point, I think. But anyway, back to society. And as a whole, so I collected small airline bottles for a while, and I thought I had an idea on doing something about alcohol, and it just seemed too cute, and I ended up changing the approach, the way I wanted to express this idea, and I tried to make a more anxiety-producing photograph, and it kind of looked, like a bad weekend, and so there it is. It's pretty self-evident, but I like to do research as part of the process, and the pieces that I show you take a minimum of a month in the studio, not the collecting time, but just the building the sculpture, lighting it, and photographing it, and just tweaking things. So along in the process, I do some research, and I didn't really know much about alcoholism. I got onto some chat rooms and found the stories were really touching, but the names for bottles were named out of convenience. That I think I kind of drew my own conclusions that the bottles were made for to secrete your alcoholism, your problem, and so they're now made out of plastic. They don't make any noise in your pocket. They don't clink against the change in your pocket, and so you could go to work with your problem and get by. So that's just one aspect. So we could try another one. These were supposed to have been outlawed in New York City, the polystyrene containers. I think 2016 was the last date I heard, but it's not a real political mover, so they're still out there, and there's no firm date on when these come out of circulation. But they have made a pronouncement about plastic bags, I think. But I think that the point that I'm getting at is in our country we really don't pay much attention to what we throw out. In the UK, it's on the news every week. And in March, they're doing a countrywide coastal cleanup that's 7,000 miles of coastline, and they have 500,000 people that have signed up for it. So there seems to be no movement here. It's kind of amazing, but then that's what were our priorities. Next one, and this is the photo that was used to promote this event. So it's a little different way of expressing the same problem, but here I made things that are the closest to making a drawing or sketches. And so there's what I call vignettes, and time seems to be an important thing to me. So I've got a sand clock, or the other clock over here is set for the 11th hour, So there's the sun, and some things have no meaning, but the, I don't know, the combined, I like kind of a community of objects, and I try to have things play off each other well. So that's what I look for when I do the work.
Is it one particular location that you find is the richest for your material? Are you thinking mostly about the area around Floyd Bennett?
Well, it's pretty much a Brooklyn project, and I go to Floyd Bennett Field. I did start at the Jersey Shore about 7-8 years ago at Long Beach Island, and have friends in the audience who will attest to that. But mostly I spend my time at Floyd Bennett Field, along the belt. There's all kinds of beach areas that people don't go, and that's where I find everything.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Next, we have Nancy Novacek. So we've been working with Nancy this year, and she has a lot to tell us about. We're going to ask her to zero in on a project called Citizen Bridge. Nancy Novacek is a Brooklyn-based artist, designer, and educator. Novacek is currently a research resident with the Cape Cod National Seashore and Fresh Kills Park. She was recently a fellow at I-Beam and has previously been supported by residencies through the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, Recess, Signal Fire, and the Sharp Walenta Studio Program. She teaches at the Stevens Institute of Technology and organizes exhibitions, panels, and events devoted to waterways and climate change, as well as bodies and technology. She has presented works in New York, Los Angeles, and the Bay Area, Canada, South America, and Europe. Let's see.
Hi. Right, so when Nicole invited me to do this, and thank you for inviting me, she said, can you talk a little bit about where Citizen Bridge came from? So the reason you're looking at projects not of the water is that my practice as an artist is really rooted in the belief that embodied experiences are a critical tool in the 21st century for identity formation, for interpersonal connection, learning, etc. And so my work is really about bringing in the world through the body. And so these are all past projects that are all, performing that or exploring that in one way or another. We can move on. Right, so this project, Citizen Bridge, in the attempt to take in the world through the body, was born actually on the shores of Red Hook, where I lived for many years. And it was the convergence of a number of things. I'm a lifelong swimmer. I grew up in Virginia, spent some summers in the Chesapeake Bay. And you can't imagine, or maybe you can imagine, the experience I had moving to New York City in the hot summer days and just having to stand on the side and stare at all that water. And so not only did I find myself staring at the water, I found myself staring at Governor's Island quite a bit. I was living in an apartment that gave me a perfect, unobstructed view of Buttermilk Channel straight across to Governor's Island. And as I started doing a lot of research around that piece of water and that island, I learned that many, 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 many years ago, there had been a sandbar connecting the two that was walkable at low tide. So the unbelievable urge to try to recreate that experience, because I'd accepted that swimming was maybe not going to be a possibility, although it kind of is now. I really became obsessed with trying to reclaim that walk and really, in a greater project, reclaiming that space as a public space. Because until I had learned about that sandbar, it had never occurred to me that the waterways are a kind of public space. They're a public space for all of us, but when we look at them, I think a lot of us, and I think this is changing, but a lot of New Yorkers still see a panorama. They see a backdrop rather than nature to be explored. And so Citizen Bridge has really been the process of unpacking the waterways and building 1,000 tiny bridges to learn all of the various and complex aspects of the waterways. So what you're looking at, if you want to go back, the project is very process-oriented, as these slides show. These are 6 of the 7 prototypes that I built by hand in cooperation with architects, neighbors, designers, artists, and writers over the span of about 5 years. So you can see on the upper left, it was an auspicious starting point. There I learned that when you build a bridge, you actually need 2 pieces to stand a chance. And over time, you can see how the project has progressed to, in 2015, the first fully engineered design, thanks to Thornton Tomasetti and Gloucester Marine Engineers in Seattle, the first fully engineered design to be registered as seaworthy. So the project is really as much a community building project, a world building project, as it is a thing building project. And if you go to the last slide, I'll just say this: as the project continues to move forward so slowly, as projects of this scope and ambition often do, the thing that has occurred to me is that at the end of the day, the bridge of this project is me. You know, I am the bridge between what I've learned here and you, and between Underwater New York and other artists. And it's great to look out and see so many of the people that have offered me advice, taught me about the waterways. And that what's true of me can be true of everyone else here. We all can be bridges when it comes to this space. So I'm excited to share what I know, all that I know about the waterways today, but I want to keep us moving.
So before we keep moving, so the citizen and Citizen Bridge is you? You're the citizen?
Well, it's really all of us. The project was titled, the project's first title was actually Marine Event, because the very first thing I did upon starting this project is I marched to the U.S. Coast Guard offices on Staten Island. And I mean, I won't say marched. I took a ferry, and then I shared a taxi, and we got a little lost. But I took to them a bunch of absurd sketches, and to their incredible credit, they didn't send me packing. They indulged the idea at the phase that it was, and explained to me very kindly that maybe possibly the way this project stood a chance to become realized was under the category of marine event. So marine events in the permitting world are things like the fireworks on the 4th of July, the boat races, right? So things that happen on the water very temporarily, where there's no kind of permanent trace left behind. So the original name of the project was Marine Event, and it turned to Citizen Bridge when I realized that what was happening is everyone was helping me build the bridge, and that it was never going to happen as a single individual effort. And so, you know, it is both me and it is all of us.
So one more follow-up question about that. I'm wondering if you could kind of wave a wand and make the bureaucracy disappear, and you could build the bridge, would that take away from what your project is?
Oh, heck no. I think, you know, getting to stand out in the harbor on these modules was a life-changing experience. I've been in boats on the water, and that's a really powerful moment, but actually standing on the water was every bit as empowering and enriching as I had seen in my mind's eye all these years. And it's something that I very desperately want to share with everyone, because being able to kind of stand in conversation with the water is just an unbelievable experience, as we are surrounded by water every day. So no, it wouldn't take away from the project at all.
Great. I hope we all get to do it. So Francis Estrada, he came to be on this panel in a slightly different way, because his work is not entirely about the waterfront. We invited him to create work about the waterfront. So when he speaks about his drawing that he made for Underwater New York and for the broadside that we printed with Wo Chan's poetry, it doesn't necessarily speak for his entire body of work. So what I'm interested in hearing about is how you approached the drawing once we kind of gave you an assignment, and then the ways in which this more watery project relates to your larger body of work. So we, during the course of thinking about Chester and Cynthia's broadside, we wanted to do two, kind of a set of broadsides. And we found out about a shipwreck of a ship called the Golden Venture in the 90s. And that's what we presented to Francis and to Woe, who is going to come up and read poetry after Francis. And they actually both had a relationship. They knew about this shipwreck already. So that's what I'm going to have Francis speak about, and I just want to introduce him first. So Francis Estrada was born in the Philippines and currently residing in Brooklyn. Francis is a visual artist, museum educator at the Museum of Modern Art, and freelance educator of Filipino art and culture. Francis has a fine arts degree in painting and drawing from San Jose State University, and he has taught in a variety of studio, classroom, and museum settings to diverse audiences, including programs for adults with disabilities, cultural institutions, and after-school programs. He was also an administrator and educator at the Museum for African Art, where he enjoyed teaching about the amalgamation of art and culture through objects. Francis exhibits his work nationally, including online publications. His work focuses on culture, history, and perception. Francis.
All right. So once again, thank you for inviting me for this project. So when I first got the invitation, I was given a link to an article about the Golden Venture. And when I started reading it, I started remembering the story. So basically, the Golden Venture was a story of 300 Chinese immigrants who paid smugglers to bring them into New York City. And I remember this happened in 1993, and right around then, my family had just recently moved to the U.S. and finally settled in Southern California. So as I was reading it, it was evoking those memories of immigration and movement, and also uncertainty in the U.S. So just a little bit of detail about the shipwreck itself and the Golden Venture. So as I said, 300 Chinese immigrants had paid these smugglers to go from Bangkok to New York City, and it took about 4 months for this travel to go on. What happened was, this vessel, this ship, the Golden Venture, was supposed to go just outside of New York City, and some smaller vessels were supposed to pick up these passengers and bring them through New York City's waterways. What happened was, I think the story was that the smaller ships, the operators of the smaller ships were arrested. So the people on the ship made the decision to then just dock outside of Rockaway Beach. But what happened was they hit a sandbar. And once they hit the sandbar, a number of the people on that ship decided to jump off and try to swim the shore to go into the city. And eventually about 10 of them died of either drowning or hypothermia. And the rest of them ended up just being arrested and detained by the INS. And I remember when I was trying to think of, okay, this is a pretty big story. I do have some memories of it. How do I come up with a drawing that that could tie everything together? And I just remembered the image in the news and in the newspapers, and the image was, if you can go backwards one more time. I remember seeing images of the immigrants on the shore of Rockaway Beach, covered up in these blue blankets that immigration officials had given them. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to draw those blankets, those blue blankets that eventually welcomed and gave temporary comfort to those immigrants that ended up on the beach. So, and speaking of my larger body of work, if you can go to the next slide, technically and compositionally, it was interesting because it really wasn't that different, because in my drawings, I tend to work with source imagery. The last image, the drawing for the Golden Venture, was based on a photograph from the New York Times. But I usually take parts of photographs and I create enough negative space to just move around and remove some information. So then you just get parts of the story. And this specific drawing was based on the People Power movement in the Philippines in the early 80s. And these were actually people who were trying to stop the tanks that were coming through as the Marcos family was being thrown out of office. So, and also interestingly enough, just recently I'd been interested in drawing and also manipulating fabric and textiles through drawing. So it kind of worked out with that composition too. And I think there's another image. Also in some of the work that I do, I don't just work with historical imagery, but I also work with personal images or photos that I found online that kind of relates to my personal experiences. And this specific one is a series of drawings called Clean Delhi, Green Delhi, where about 7 years ago, my wife and I were living in the Delhi during the Commonwealth Games. And there were all these signs that say Clean Delhi, Green Delhi, but right around there was just trash strewn all over the place. And also, so many people were just peeing all over the place. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go to India. I'm going to have all these images and colors and experience that I can draw from. But I ended up drawing was just people urinating in the streets. Water.
And Francis, just because we can't tell from the projection, can you just share with everybody what materials you use?
They're all charcoal and paper. And what I try to do is I try to just use one type of charcoal and just either erase into it or add onto it again instead of just using different grades or different hardness of charcoal. So just charcoal and paper.
Beautiful. So with Francis's work, I think fresh in our head, I want to invite up Woe. So let me introduce Woe, and I'll project their broadside. So Woe Chan is a poet and drag performer. They have received fellowships from NYFA, Kundiman, Lambda Literary, the Asian American Writers Workshop, and Poets House. Woe has performed work at venues including National Sawdust, Dixon Place, New York Live Arts, and is currently a standing member of Brooklyn-based drag burlesque collective Switch and Play. Woe is currently an MFA candidate in poetry at NYU. After Woe reads, I'm going to ask you to stay up here, and then Cynthia, you'll come join us too. Okay, here's Woe.
Thank you, Francis, for introducing all of that. I have this little book that I got from the Museum of Chinese in America, and I was reviewing it on my way here. But it's such a long story, and now can you hear me? And you kind of got like the first half, but then the story gets even wilder afterwards when they're detained and imprisoned. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that after the poem. Where can you harmlessly place your devotion? For what faint ideas of a dream would you lift a flag? Some noted lifetime, some fingers freely a hemisphere. Some oil cut on broad, plain hands, some torpor inching down, some family trees, some live, unexpectedly live, and some sudden blowout. Chrysanthemums choke you still in the throat into spring, some emotionless turn of face, some paraphrase. Sunlight shines blue through some skin, sometimes to agree with the enemy. Some life is precious, some imitation crab meat, and that's wild mouth surrender, some crowded back teeth, those ankles strapped with plastic, some bottleneck house, some room on the lifeboat spared, some clamoring sheer, some days appearing, some before.
So everybody just scoot.
Yeah. Sure.
Watch out for the corns.
Okay, so thank you for sharing your work, everybody. I think, Woe, since you left us with that cliffhanger, we probably want to start and hear about how the story got crazier, and then we'll talk a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. So, you hear me? Good. Let's see. So about 300 undocumented people crashed ashore on the beach. 10 people died, and this was kind of one of the first times that so many people entered the U.S. so publicly. I think more conservative news stations had a field day with this, and I was 2 years old at the time, so I didn't see the televisions. But apparently, a lot of immigration lawyers agree that this case of the Golden Venture and 9/11 were kind of the two big events that completely changed the way that we think about American borders and our immigration system. So after these folks got taken in, no one really knew what to do with them, so they all got detained and moved upstate into a county prison in York County. And I think they were held there for about five to 6 years. But during the time that people were trying to figure out what to do with them and what process that we had to process so many people who came in at once, the folks started this, it's like, they started making art, essentially, and they started making a lot of art. And the art they were making were these huge folded statues and sculptures and paper mache combinations of different, a lot of them were very patriotic, a lot of them were eagles, some of them were Mickey Mouse smoking a cigarette, anything that I think would appeal to the American public. And what happened with these pieces, they would get auctioned off to pay the pro bono lawyers and auctioned off as a way to create more publicity. But some of these pieces of art are actually on display right now in the Museum of Chinese in America. They're having their exhibit, which goes on until March 25th. I highly suggest you all go. First Thursdays are free, which means this coming February 1st. You can go for free. You can see some of the, actually it's amazing, like you can see some of the original, they're like, some pieces are like this tall off the ground, and they were just working with folding old magazines and using toilet paper and Elmer's glue and like highlighters to color the pieces. It's really wild. But yeah, I don't know. I sit there and think about what it would feel like to be in prison in the U.S., in a place that you wanted to go so badly that you would, put yourself on a really old boat, travel 4 months around the world, and then to be imprisoned, and then to be making eagles, of all things. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just, I don't know where you have to be emotionally for that, to process that.
Thank you, Wo, for sharing that. So building a little bit off of this Broadside project and also off of Nancy's works on water, something that we talk a lot about at Underwater New York is the idea of water art, and this idea that maybe something about water art is that it's collaborative. And a lot of what happened with the broadsides, but also a lot of what you each were talking about with your artwork, I think speaks to collaboration. So I would love to hear a little bit from you about how collaboration plays into your practice, into your work, into this specific project. Maybe Cynthia, would you tell us a little bit about what writing this poem was like for you to start off?
Of course. Well, I had written a middle passage poem before from the perspective of a survivor. So approaching Chester's beautiful photograph, I first thought, wow, they look beautiful. They all look beautiful. They're in pain or they're not in pain, but they all look beautiful. So how can I put that beauty, that painful beauty, in a poem? And I think as poets, our jobs are to educate and to promote empathy. So I had to think of the water being something that takes us, saves us, can be a refuge, and can also be a grave. So those 4 things I was thinking about simultaneously. And having the photo on my phone, and then on my wall, and then everywhere else for a good week or 2, and just looking at it. And I finally thought about, okay, well, let's focus on these women and their materials, the saffron bolts of their dress. What does it mean to them? What does it mean to me? And being on a boat and not being able to move, what would you think about? How would you feel? So I had to go that route, the round-the-way approach, I guess.
Great, thank you. Who else can speak to collaboration?
I can speak to collaboration.
Great.
Let me step up to the mic. I've said this before in some other conversations, but the water is inherently collaborative because it has some risk, right? It has some healing and spiritual properties, but there's definitely a risk there. And in order to accomplish anything on the water, in my experience, it definitely takes more than one person. And in fact, I didn't love sea shanties so much until I started making work on the water, and I realized that these songs, these sea shanties are work songs to coordinate the physical labor of sailors, right? Nothing could be more beautiful to me than actually getting to sing, to actually bring everyone into a kind of physical rhythm, to get everyone to move together and to work together. And my favorite moments throughout Citizen Bridge, which has been nothing but collaborative, have been at the moments where I've been working at schools. So I worked with the Webb Institute out on Long Island, which is a maritime school for maritime engineering, et cetera, and architecture. And also working with students at the Harbor School, right? High school kids that you normally think of as being, kind of not really in control of their bodies and like kind of, hormonally all over the place. These kids, when it came to working on the water, they became different people. They became a kind of single, unified, beautiful body, working towards a singular goal of getting a boat in the water. There are these protocols that everyone learns first thing when you go out into the water that ensures everyone's safety, but also ensures everyone's that everyone's collective effort, brings everyone out onto the water. And you mentioned a project, Works on Water, that I was also involved in. That's, that has been really meaningful, and some of my collaborators are here. It was the first art triennial dedicated to art on the water. And so we were so excited to partner with Underwater New York and a bunch of other artists to really bring all of our work together in space and time, which was a huge collaborative effort. But yeah, I just don't see how we can talk about water and not simultaneously talk about collaboration.
So maybe something else that we can't talk about water and not also talk about is the idea of activism. So when I went to see the exhibition Waterfront, which we're here celebrating, I was really struck by a lot of aspects of it. One of the areas that I kind of zeroed in on was photographs of women working in the waterfront, the Brooklyn waterfront in the 1940s. And one of the aspects of that labor that the Brooklyn Historical Society was really underlining was how unequal the compensation for that labor was, particularly when it was women of color who were doing it. So thinking about the history of our New York City waterfront, as so many of these artists have been talking about, and thinking about the ways that that history intersects with our present contemporary issues, thinking about refugees and detention, thinking about the environmental effects of climate change, of pollution in New York City. I think activism is really intertwined with water. But I also know that a lot of times people give activism to artists when it's not necessarily your job or your goal to be sort of speaking on an issue. So I'm curious about each of you, what the role of activism is in your work, if you see yourself as activists, if you see your artwork that way, or if it's the action of doing the art that is yours and the activism is in the interpretation. I know that's a big question. Chester, I wonder if I can start.
Go.
Ready to go. So you can.
Oh, I'd like to get to that question because I like to talk about, we live near Fort Greene Park, and, there is a crypt, ossuary of bones of all of these young kids during the time of the Revolutionary War who rebelled against the British. And the British answer was to have these huge jails that were in boats on the harbor, and that whoever went to these jails never made it out alive. So this ossuary is made up of all these young upper-class kids in the Revolutionary War who were entombed, essentially, on these boats. But I like, if I can, to make another point about collaboration. As a photographer, I sort of have to, if the thing doesn't exist, I really can't make it. So for me, and these images that I made, these images could not have been made if people themselves were not living and then having their own conversation about identity and the water. And it's only because that they existed and they have established these social constructs of recognition, whether it's to preserve an old building that was a slave castle, or was it to preserve a faith of the African people, and to use the water as a table of offering, or whether it was something that burned in their memory that they felt they had to physicalize this particular feeling of trying to come to grips with these things. So on one level, what I do could not happen without the collaboration of people who've already set these things in motion. On the other level, I just say that we collaborate with the spirit. We collaborate what is physically in front of us. And I'm very taken by the different voices of the water at different times of day. In the slack of tide, there's a particular voice. At sunrise, there's a particular voice. During the rushing, and we have different voices in our New York water because you have the East River, which is really an actuary. So one voice comes in with one tide, and it reverses and goes out with another one. And then you have what I'm really attracted to also is a voice of the water when it's like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, where the water sort of comes alive with silver because of the way the angle of the sun. And then you have the afternoon voice and you have the evening voice. And all of those voices speak to all of us in different ways, whether we're artists or not. Artists, I think, are more susceptible to these voices, and we feel we are somehow pressured or obligated to produce something that reflects that feeling. But we are in collaboration with nature, fundamentally. Whether you're an environmentalist, whether you're a constructionist, whether you're having a feeling about the memory of water, we're all in conversation with this thing that never stops giving.
Thank you, Chester.
Okay, I don't know where to start on this one. I feel like the project I end up working on for a lot of my life, the last 10 years or so, was sort of predetermined for me. It's in my blood, and so I was at the first Earth Day in 1970. I was doing what I do now. I was cleaning up. I was picking up trash along the side of the road. So it's almost, it's just part of me.
And do you feel like so you were talking about how long it takes you to assemble your artworks. As you're doing that, is the idea of activism and the message kind of enmeshed with the aesthetics of it?
No, I think it's purely a struggle to make something I like and make it work. At that point, I don't think about the cause or the politics. I'm just working with these toys, basically. So I get to play a lot. But I don't know, the politics of it didn't really come to me initially. What happened was I was really attracted by the changes that the elements had, the salt water, the sun, the sand. The labels were missing on a lot of products, and they had been transformed. So I was just attracted to this kind of aged stuff. And in the process of making these pictures, I started getting feedback, and I started realizing that I was doing an environmental project. So I didn't sit around initially and say, well, what am I going to do with my life? I just went out and did something, and then it turned into what it did.
So kind of through collaboration. Francis, you wanna speak to this?
Sure. I'm going to try to see if I can keep this as succinct, but also hit a big picture about the work that I do too. So, like I said before, I've always been interested in history, and some of the history I've been interested in is pre-colonial and colonial Philippine history as it relates to Philippine colonial history under the Spanish and under the Americans. And I took inspiration from a group of Filipinos who were living in Europe in the late 1800s. They were called the Indios Bravos. And what they wanted to do, they were a group of painters, writers, politicians who wanted to use art in a way to show their colonists, the Spanish, that they can govern themselves. So they would join expositions, art competitions in Spain, and eventually two of the painters actually won the silver and gold prizes in Madrid 2 years in a row. And I basically took that kind of inspiration. I started doing that with my own drawings too, my own drawings, paintings, and just different artwork, where I would then explore the history that I'd never learned in the Philippines, but I started learning once I moved to the US. So some of those works that I do, I then present to wider audiences. They don't have to be Filipino, but maybe it could be an audience that might just be interested in that history or could find any relation to it. So some of the images that I use are images that I find from the Library of Congress. Some of them are ethnographic images. Some of them are images I see in the newspapers. Some I just kind of mix as well. And this is actually the first time I worked on a broadside, but I also find texts from old teachers who had taught, these are American teachers who taught in the Philippines in the early 1900s, who would describe their experiences and also just have strange stereotypes of Filipinos there. They would even try to paraphrase the way that they would speak. So then, basically, as a form of activism, I use my artwork to show images of representation or misrepresentation or just not an overall understanding of people itself.
Thank you. So I think that we have time for a couple audience questions. There's going to be a microphone that we can pass around, and you're welcome to ask of all the panelists or to zero in on somebody you have a specific question for. And maybe just raise your hand if you have one. And as you're thinking, I have more. So as those are percolating, so let me find my quote. So we talked a little bit about the subtitle of this panel, which is Art in Action, but the title of the panel is Current Bodies, Current/Bodies, which comes from Laurie Anderson's Language of the Future. And the quote is, it's really about how she says one thing instantly replaces another. And the New York City waterfront is really a place of constant change. So maybe as people are thinking, we'll see if there's one or two questions, but if somebody wants to speak to the role of change on the waterfront in your work, those of you who are working specifically at the waterfront.
Well, I have a question for Nancy. You told me that channel once had a sandbar.
Yep.
How things have changed, because I remember 20 years ago, there was a deep port for the Coast Guard on that side of the island.
Yeah, and it still is. And you can
It still is.
Yeah. You can go back and read through the New York Times starting in the late 1800s. The kind of like the drumming of support for this idea of channelizing Buttermilk Channel and trenching it to create a second major shipping thoroughfare directly to the Navy Yard. And so that was a gorgeous example of the convergence of political will and economics at work. And even in the past 6 years that I've been working on this project, the channel is still a channel, but huge changes have happened even in the past 6 years. We can see right down in Dumbo the complete architectural landscape change. We can walk farther south into Red Hook, you guys have probably been following all of the conversations around what's going to happen to the Red Hook waterfront, and now very recently with Cuomo's idea of moving the Red Hook terminal south. You can look at the changes that are happening in Industry City. You know, it's like the city woke up 10 years ago and realized that it had a waterfront again. And so the experience, the changes that we're seeing now, and they seem like they're happening a mile a minute, but they've actually been in process for the past 10 to 15 years. You know, and what's interesting now, although this is a conversation about the New York City waterfront, is that our waterfront has been so developed in such a glorious fashion to the outside world. The development is now spreading southward to Philadelphia. And so the changes that are happening here are becoming a model for other places. And so they're social, they're economic, they're political, I mean, it's the whole 9 yards. That I've witnessed just working within this very tiny kind of piece of land from basically Atlantic Avenue south to Hamilton Avenue. It's a huge amount of change.
Can I add something to that? The area that I work, Floyd Bennett Field and Dead Horse Bay, we think highly of waterfront property today, but back when those were used as landfills, there had to be a place to put all the trash, and it was close and convenient, but it was an island, so it was called Barren Island. But now if you drive out on Flatbush and continue toward the Rockaways, it's one piece of land. It's now Barren Island's attached to mainland Brooklyn by trash. So that's kind of a growth mechanism. And if you drive along the belt, there's housing developments that were built on top of other landfills, and there's still landfills that are just kind of aging out now all along the belt. So they could be future housing places or parks.
Speaking of landfill, everybody I'm sure must know this, but Barry Park is a landfill.
I think it's called land reclamation. As though the land once was there.
Okay, one more thing. In the 1800s, you could buy plots of water, and then you filled it in with whatever fill you had, and you then built a building or a house or whatever you wanted. And so that's how the waterfront expanded into the East River on both sides of the river.
Yeah, very, very liberal, visible change.
So I had a question for Chester, but I think it could be anyone who wants to answer this as well. But I was thinking about what you said about you can't make photos unless someone else is already living their life. For a photo series that has such a historical bent on it, I was curious how the people, the subjects in your photos in their current lives, how much you talked about with them of what you were doing and how much their current lives influenced what you're making.
Well, thank you. Very good question. I tend to do a lot of research to find out where things are happening, and because since as a journalist, my training is really not really to interfere with people, not to set something up. Sometimes I've broken that rule, but it's rare. I find it better for what I'm interested in is to find like-minded people who are traveling down that same road. And if they're traveling down that same road, given the level of consciousness, they are bound to touch certain footprints, so to speak. And I just do the research to find out, and everybody's at different places, to find out who's where. And to eliminate from those who's where by visiting or looking at it to determine which one photographically works best, that my photographs can help become an amplifier to what they're doing.
Thank you. Any other questions? Great. So, thank you so much, everybody. We loved having you here.
Thank you.
And Thank you to the Brooklyn Historical Society. Thank you to Irving Bottle for the wine. Thank you to poets and writers. And the broadsides that feature Woe and Cynthia's poetry and Francis and Chester's images are available for sale here in the gift shop. So definitely check that out. And I hope that you'll follow all of these artists from now on, now that you're introduced to them. Thank you, everybody.